BioShock has been sort of in the company's blood for a very long time, and it's a game we sort of always wanted to do and always talked about. And we, for a while, didn't have a name, but then I think probably around 4 or 5 years ago, sort of the name BioShock came around for it. And we always had a bunch of design principles that were pretty firm, that it was a game that was going to take first-person shooting in a different direction, build upon principles of games we had done before, like System Shock 2, but really then take a different tack with that, where that game was very sort of under the hood, numbery and RPG statty, to really say let's work on world simulation and immersion and AI, and build up player choice through things he can see in the world rather than numbers that are working under the hood.
You know, we really started with this idea of, well, let's make a game like Shock 2, but make it our own, make it different. And, you know, we didn't really have a story or anything like that. All we had this idea for what kind of gameplay we wanted. So this kind of emergent world, a sandbox world, and we just wanted to build out from there.
When it first started out, it was set in different times. You know, it's gone from everything from modern day to the far future, until we eventually, you know, set it back in time somewhat, especially with the architecture.
And we built, you know, internally funded and built a couple of prototypes, which are radically different from what the game is today. But I think, you know, when you're trying to do something like BioShock, it's not something you sort of wake up one morning and like know what it is right away. And it was, you know, the collective talent of a lot of people and a lot of time to get the game where it is today.
We did a demo early on, probably 2003, that I wish we could find it. It was on Xbox One, and it was, you know, it was still underwater, but it looked a lot like a space station, and everything was really clean and Star Trek-y, and the monsters were of like the Scooby-Doo variety. It was all over the place as far as aesthetics.
The story evolved a lot over time. Like originally, you know, once we had this notion of that there was a genetic engineering experimentation going on in the world, we started thinking, what would that do? We started thinking, what would that do to this culture? And originally, we had this notion that the city was run by a series of what we called savants.
We started out with this concept of savants that were like these genetically engineered characters that went so far they became sort of like brains in a jar kind of thing, and you were originally going to defeat a different savant on every level as you progress through the game, and it just, there were too many characters, they didn't make any sense, and it got really out of control, so we sort of pulled back from some of those ideas.
Plus interacting with a guy in a jar isn't...
Yeah, it was like, how are you going to have a boss fight with a guy in a jar? It was just a stupid idea, ultimately.
You know, we had this 212-page design document laying out how every single thing in the game would work, from the controller mapping down to, you know, all the scripting components for the designers. And I mean, the programming team did an amazing job, and we got all of that stuff done. But it just wasn't helping us create the experience we wanted to make. So we all had to come step back from that and say, well, you know, what went wrong? And so that was a low point. But it was very good in a way, in that it made us realize that I think we were designing in our heads and then just throwing it over the fence. And you know, the programmers were working on this huge backlog of tasks they had to do, and slowly feeding that to the designers. But by the time the designers got the technology they requested, they had forgotten they even wanted it. I mean, it was that kind of process where it was like, you know, a slow-moving pipeline. And we changed our process to be more of an iterative one, where programmers were working very closely with designers and saying, well, what are we trying to do right now? What's this experience we're trying to make? How do we do that? What is the, you know, minimal set of tech we need to make that happen? And, you know, let's get it done and try it really quick. And so we took that low point and kind of turned it into, I think it became kind of a turning point for the project. So that was very good.
The original design was like way heavier into RPG type things as well. We had prerequisites on everything. You couldn't hack this unless you had that. You couldn't shoot this unless you found that. Like,
really
there was all
couldn't do
kinds
anything.
of stuff.
Really, it was,
yeah, and
it was,
as we started getting these systems working, we were just like, gamers have to do way too much to get to the cool, fun stuff in this game. So we just started stripping all of that away, and it got more and more at its heart. The heart of the shooter kept bubbling more and more to the top.
E3 was great for us. That was, I think, the first point where the team I mean, one of the great things about working on games is that you work together as a team, and you go through these like crunches where you're all driving towards this huge deadline. And contrasting that with the original Vision demo that we did, E3 was an experience where like we got done and we said, yeah, like this really is showing us that we can make our vision a reality. So that was a huge motivating force for the team. Everybody's really excited, and of course, like we didn't expect to get all the great press that we got. So that was really gratifying and rewarding.
And we looked at all these cool systems we had and all the weapons and the plasmas. We said, well, if we took all this stuff and like really focused on a shooter, we could have the deepest shooter like pretty much ever. And
Right.
we didn't want to miss on that opportunity.
You know, the E3 demo was kind of showing you the mood of BioShock and the world and the art direction. And for Barcelona, we wanted to show people, well, all right, well, we've shown you how kind of creepy and different this game is and why it's interesting visually and conceptually. Now let's show you why it's going to be an amazing shooter. And that was great. Basically, you know, took all the little bits of the game that happened emergently and threw them all into one demo so you can see like what happens when all hell breaks loose in this game.
What we did with that, we had this huge chunk of a level and sort of all these things sort of sprawling around, and then Ken came in one day and he was like, okay, here's the theme of the demo. The theme is hunting the big daddy. I want to know that we're starting here and our goal is this and we do these things on our way and then we get there and we have the climax. And it's the combination of him having that vision and us knowing how much we have to throw at it that makes a presentation for the fans. It says like, look, we're just telling you a little story. This is how to understand our game.
And actually after that demo, when we realized how amazing that experience was, Ken came up to me and he said, well, you know, the Exo 6 demo where you're fighting, you know, you have two security bots and they're fighting this giant protector who's on fire, and there's a gatherer and there's this guy throwing grenades off the balcony at you and you're shooting machine guns and stuff's exploding. He says, you know, it's amazing. I'm glad we pulled that off. Now, I want the game to be like that all the time. And I looked at him and I was like, I don't know if we can do that. You know, because that was a very small level in the game. And so coming off that high point in Barcelona, heading downward, realizing we had to make the whole game like that, that took some adjusting. But then we actually started pulling it off, which is great. You know, our tech team in Australia has been just optimizing. And just when we think we've squeezed the last ounce of power out of the PC or the console, like they find another way to improve it. And the game is actually like that all the time now. Like you're constantly having these massive battles, all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And it's great to see that. I mean, comparing it with games I've played in the past and worked on in the past, the current game is just so much more dense and chaotic, and at the same time still very creepy and lonely and dystopian. So I think we kind of achieved our vision, and hopefully people will like the game.
The game stories I do tend to evolve out of the game I'm working on. You know, sometimes they're very natural. Like when we made Freedom Force, I wanted to make a, you know, I wanted to make a real sort of on-the-nose comic book story. And System Shock 2, we had, you know, we had something to start with. We had the System Shock world to start with. You know, in Tribes, we worked out of that universe. But here it was like we really sort of were starting something that had no real precedent. And so I was sort of like waited for the game to tell me what the story should be. And there was a lot of things that evolved over the course of the game that sort of pointed in that direction. Like, you know, we knew we wanted the game to be in a place that was remote from the world, but complete. Because whenever I play games that take place in an actual place, like, you know, you have a game that takes place in Seattle or New York, and you go up to you know, there's a Jersey barrier there you can't jump over, or you go up to a guy who's like working in a store and you can only say one or two things to him. And that always frustrates me because I'd rather simulate something completely and give the player never press on that suspension of disbelief where the player's like, wait, why can't I do that? I'd rather make a world where the player can do everything they can expect to do. And I think the team wants to do that. And so we had to sort of come up with a place that was natural, that where you could do everything you wanted to do, but also you're never saying, why can't I just get in a car and drive off? Or why can't I talk to that guy? Or why can't I talk to this guy? And you know, this underwater city sort of came out of that if there was this place that was cut off that you couldn't leave, and that was self-contained. We could really go to town and simulate not just the world, but the culture and the products and the people and the history. And I didn't want to do like a strange science fiction world, because that's always going to be hard to relate to. So we made a place that was sort of like its own little alternate history. And everything sort of evolved out of that, because I had to ask myself, if we're going to make this believable, why would somebody build a city at the bottom of the ocean? And that's where BioShock's story came from. Is like asking that question, why would somebody do this? And trying to come up with a believable answer, and everything came out of that. The city of Rapture was built by Andrew Ryan and his team with a real strong philosophical bent, and that bent was that people, as he says, is a man not entitled to the sweat of his own brow. And he was, he lived in a time in America where he came, first of all, he was born in the Soviet Union, and during around the time of the revolution, or before the revolution, and he saw what happened with the revolution, and he was an anti-communist, and he came to America. He felt that if he was a great man, he should be entitled to the fruit of his own labor. He didn't want the government or the church or anybody else telling him what was or wasn't his, which I think is to an American is a very sort of understandable concept. And he felt so strongly about this that he felt he couldn't stay in America, especially with the coming threat of nuclear war, with the new nuclear weapons after World War II. And he wanted to take what he considered the best and the brightest people to a place where they could practice their craft, whatever their craft was, artist, scientist, industrialist, and do it without another person's hand in their pocket. And that's why he created Rapture. In BioShock, the Civil War happens because of very natural things: greed, sex, jealousy, power, all the things that screw up everything in reality, but also the things that drive us all are the very things that cause the Civil War in Rapture. The great thing I think about BioShock, from where I'm sitting as a writer, is that nobody's perfect. Like, there are no paragons. There is no Gandalf. There is no Ben Kenobi. All the characters you encounter, Tenenbaum and Atlas and Ryan, and the people you hear about like Fontaine, and the people you hear about in their audio diaries and you encounter, everybody is flawed in substantial ways. And you're sort of put in this position with all these moral choices of like, who am I going to listen to? And there's no black hats and white hats, and everybody's had a sort of a dark gray. Well, the diaries are a great way of telling the story, though we have to assume that not everybody's going to listen to all those, because these are people playing a first-person shooter. There's going to be a contingent of people who really care about that, and we really support them. The story is really detailed and rich. And there's incredible amount of detail. You can put the whole history of Rapture together from those audio diaries. We very carefully wrote them and chose them. There's just listening to the world, listening to the public service announcements as you walk around the world, various advertisements from the world, just seeing the vending machines, watching the Big Daddy and Little Sister interact, seeing these sort of ghostly scenes that you come across, and you find out why there are ghosts in Rapture. There's a dozen storytelling mediums in the game, and they're all really rich, and they're all designed that even the person who's playing it the most casual way is going to get a sense of what's happening here.
It's a challenge. I mean, it's always a challenge, and this is a challenge that's gone on as long as there's been video games, and certainly it's been highlighted since the age of 3D video games, because you have artists trying to achieve what they're trying to achieve, and designers, trying to achieve a game space and a play space. I mean, the best situations, you find that they complement each other, that a space that's good for tactical combat tends to look good for art, because it means there's pillars and architectural features and light in different places. So when those things happen, it's great. Other areas, we will thrash out right till the very end, trying to get them right, trying to get concordance between design and art. And there's shouting, and eventually, we get every space to where it needs to be.
Well, the compromise comes, when design roughs in a space, and they require the player, for example, work its way up the scaffolding or these fallen columns. But the space, the narrative of the space is a subway station, and sometimes that doesn't make sense for the type of space you're trying to create. So there's this back and forth. It's fun. It's challenging.
So you change the gameplay, and change the space, and meet in the middle.
You just rip out all their stuff. And
and they just ignore everything they have to say. I think on the first vision demo that we did, which was it's something we do to like shake out both how the gameplay is going to play out and an early pass on what the art's going to feel like. That treatment was really dry. It was period. The technology of that era was there. It was very 1940s. Anywhere from the 30s to the 60s in technology. It still used early aviation technology and railroad technology. But it was a very flat interpretation of it. It sort of looked like the New York City Underground, the tunnels there in the era they were built. And there was really no attempt to go much beyond that then. And I think when we came out of that, we all agreed it was too dry, too brown and flat.
it was also more of what you would have expected from an undersea base.
Yeah, it was. I think that we came into it with the idea of, well, how can we actually make this work? How would it be practical? It just came out looking way too practical. Yes, they would build everything with concrete and tiles, but that ended up being really stale. It looked like every level was going to sort of feel like that. So from there, we had to turn, and we did a few early attempts at this. One of the first was the train station, which still exists sort of in the game and Welcome as the Kashmir restaurant. And that was the first time we started using things like carpeting, parquet floors, like decorative pillars instead of practical, poured concrete. And then we introduced the advertising and a lot of decorative elements. And we knew we were much more on the right track there.
The first thing that we had to get our head around was Art Deco, and a few of the guys have a bit of a background in that. I was the person who slept through art history, so I can spot it. It took me a while to separate Nouveau from Deco and then pass that on to some of the other junior artists who were really coming up to speed with that. But that was the first real problem we had to solve. From there, concepting spaces, trying to work with design on coming up with cool things, cool landmarks for the player to see, getting those nailed down, crying a lot when you slave over ideas like that and it gets cut. Those are just a few of the huge problems we've had to solve.
That was one of those things that just sort of materialized as, we were trying different art styles and things like that to try to avoid really video gamey spaces. That was one of the things we went with. So
I'll tell you, it's a fantastic way to get art direction props because, what game is set in a time period like that, It's usually just some sci-fi gray-brown world.
Yeah, and so we had our the opportunity to pick and choose, from objects and architecture that did exist and really just mold it into new things and sort of blow it out of proportion too, even the simplest little things. And I think the first exteriors I remember that we did were much more functional looking, of course. Like they looked like, I remember thinking about, and I did some early visualizations of, well, if you have a building on the seafloor and there's, the seafloor is constantly moving, how do you balance that building? And, eventually we threw all that stuff out and decided that, it's a much bigger impression to really see the city that's sort of just sunk. It looks just like a city, and it played into the fact that Rapture was sort of a terrible idea in the first place. It never could have possibly worked, and that hubris and that vanity that they thought it could work. It played better to see an entire city. It needed to look a little preposterous and ridiculous, but also beautiful. And it's easier, I think, for the player to identify with that time period and, with what we were intending to say about this being a city, rather than it being like these domes on the seafloor. We would do walkthroughs of the level and, try to hit key points that make the player feel they're constantly underwater, whether that's a leak in the ceiling that's depositing water on the floor. And you never know how that stuff's going to work out. You kind of put it in there, but once it got in there with final effects and sound, I think it turned out to be really convincing. You can't turn a corner without, seeing or hearing or feeling water in some way.
When we first started building everything, we would go through, and then Scott, our director, he would go, dude, you have to flood the area or something. Put some water somewhere. Make people drowning. Stick things. Break pipes. Break the ceiling. So we had to look for. Basically, we ended up taking a look at first, really, it was just hard to train yourself to put water in places because I mean, you don't usually flood anywhere wherever you're going to make anything. I mean, I don't think I've ever worked on a game where I flooded everything. And in this game, it was really actually a conscious effort to go, how can I flood this area and make it look interesting and not make it look overdone?
You try to keep these strings of narrative, so the narratives that go through the whole game, like the Civil War narrative, or how commercial the society was, or this conflict between Ryan and Fontaine. You try to just get little bits to keep the player, keep reminding them of what's going on and what went on. But it's very difficult in a game like this where time has passed in some ways between the backstory, front story, and when you're playing, that you have to be really careful not to visually confuse the player and keep those themes continuous. In some ways, we had originally thought to have evidence of the Civil War throughout the game, starting from the very beginning. But unfortunately, it didn't make much sense because the player hadn't really been told about that yet. So a lot of that we pulled and pushed towards the back of the game. So as the player learns more about what happened in Rapture, those things sort of come at the right time in the story for them to actually see them and actually see evidence of the Civil War right around the time they hear about the Civil War. So
Yeah, there's so many layers, and when you're trying to sell the story of a crazy surgeon in the medical deck, it really didn't make sense to paint on top of that this Civil War with the limited space and player RAM.
Because it would keep that narrative from punching through. I think a lot of the levels, and the art was refocused at a point in development based on this idea that really art, design, programming, everybody came with the same time, there's this real sense in the early levels of an individual within that level, an NPC, or an enemy, that defines his story. It's his personal narrative of Rapture, or her personal narrative of Rapture. And in the early stages, there's a character you will associate with each level, and each one has a different story to tell about Rapture. Not directly to you, but through the level that you see in front of them and through their behavior in the game. And so we would go through and just try to support that character in that level so that you really feel like that's his home. And each one becomes just layers your knowledge of what happened at Rapture until the very end.
It's a really great way of lending local color to any specific zone,
Because you can't tell the story of what happened to thousands of people in any great detail. So you pick one of those thousands and be like, this is the arc he took, and here's how it affected the people around him.
Of the characters in the game, the Protector is probably the one that has changed the least. That concept of guys in diving suits being these big, tough Protector-type guys has pretty much stayed with us the whole time.
He was the one thing that stayed, that was persistent through the whole development process. Once we really started and sat down and started doing concepts, he was what he would look like entirely changed over a period of a few months. The very first drawing I did was a guy in a dive suit, and we knew we wanted those guys in. But the actual details of what that would be for the Big Daddies did change, but we always knew we wanted a guy in a dive suit.
We originally had 4 Protectors, and we had to, we made one cut, and then we made another cut, and we're down to 2. And we had put in a lot of work to one of the Protectors that, in the end, we realized that if we wanted to have the polish time for the 2 main Protectors, that we would have to cut this one that we called the Slow Pro. The Slow Pro,
It's the heavy artillery.
yeah, he's basically the tank. The Slow Pro was his full name. Again, we have the dumbest names, I apologize, but Slow Pro is Slow Protector effed up melee.
Nice.
Man, it's for the kids,
If Nate was in here right now, he'd be crying. It's his favorite concept.
One of them got cut, which I'm not happy about.
Yeah, he was cool.
That was maybe my favorite one.
Yeah.
It's still not clear to me why I got cut. Probably just to hurt me.
Originally, we had the whole ecology system, and the gatherers were actually not girls. They were these slugs, these little slugs that flew around, and if you got near them, they'd roll up and start clicking, and that's when the Protector would come in and attack you. And we had the full animation for those guys were working fine, and you step back and it's like we want to build this relationship between the Protectors and the gatherers, and nobody cares about a slug.
It wasn't really much of a choice to whether or not you wanted to harvest them or not. It was just like, that's an ugly sea slug. I want to kill that little.
Yeah. It was like you just wanted to stomp on them. Yeah. They were really nasty, and they just looked like things you squished. But it took us like a long time to find a gatherer that we liked.
Yeah.
Like we went through, we started getting concepts from everyone internally was working on it, and we even had outsourcing concept artists like throwing their ideas into the mix.
You got to dig some of those up. Remember the little squirrely
Yeah, there
guy
was
that
this little.
like-
There was one that was like this little like gerbil man.
There were crabs. There were, going with the whole underwater theme.
There was a consideration they might be monkeys at one point, which that idea didn't last long.
I'll admit it, my bad idea was a dog whose front legs could move, but its back legs were bound in a wheelchair, going around eating stuff. Yeah, that's a bad idea.
There was like this little hunchback Oompa Loompa type of guy, and eventually we started seeing that the more humanoid we got, the better it felt.
Ultimately, it came down to just you don't have sympathy for any of those characters, or you don't want to interact with them.
And then Rob Waters, our in-house concept guy who worked on all of our stuff in recent years, drew this incredibly creepy looking little girl, and that was like, this is the way we've got to go. It's incredibly creepy, and it can be expressive. And one of the biggest problems with the slug back in the time was he had no appendages, he had no face, he had no eyes. Like you
He had
just
no lower jaw even.
yeah, you couldn't even. You had no idea what this thing was trying to communicate to you as a gamer.
Having her evolve from an insect into, another tentacle monster, all the way to this idea that it's these little girls. I think it was just exciting because you're crossing a line there I don't think people expect, and having Ken come up with ideas like that, and these challenging ideas you have to illustrate and sell to an audience, and make it edgy without going over the line. I think that was just rewarding, challenging. Hopefully we've done a good job with that.
Specifically, the splicer characters changed a lot over time, and they came from a lot of different places. It was before I think the story had really gelled, and before the architecture had gelled. And interestingly enough, those have a lot of effect on what the characters are going to look like, because they really have to sit down in that world and live in that world. And we talked before how we changed the aesthetic of the facility from much more industrial, practical sort of place to a much more residential place. And I think that when we saw that happening in the architecture, then we realized we had to go back and look at these splicers again. And they had to be as sort of domestic looking as that world. So they, some of the original passes, you'll see monsters that, are very monstrous. And that was one angle that we were thinking about, that there are genetic distortions and how maybe they even specifically mutated themselves to be able to use certain weapons better, or like things like arms would go away because they didn't need that arm. They had such a specific duty that they'd created for themselves. And then again, as we moved away from that, we basically went back to square one, and then Rob took over. And we came up with pretty much the splicers you see now. A lot of the distortions in the faces came from, actually Ken had found this thing online, and it was called Project Facade,
Yeah.
which was, it's terrifying. It basically was some of the early attempts at sort of plastic and reconstructive surgery to treat soldiers at the end of World War I. Who suffered horrible injuries to their face, and it was these sort of creative solutions to reconstruct their faces. And of course, the medicine wasn't really there, so sometimes the product was as terrifying as where they started out. But those were kind of a disturbing inspiration for some of the faces some of the ways that you see the splicers' faces are distorted. Came from looking at those pictures.
Yeah.
Cringing at those pictures.
Yeah. The other reference was looking at old mugshots from the 1940s. For whatever reason, just times were harder or whatever, and you could just really see it in their faces, and just some of those portraits were just sort of inspiration for, a really sort of different looking character.
And hairstyles. Just
Yeah.
some really bizarre hairstyles.
Yeah.
For criminals, then.
On the technology side, as far as graphics goes, a giant leap from our past projects in terms of capabilities of our renderer, the tool sets available to our artists. I mean, in the last game we did, SWAT 4, was basically, you know, here's a couple things you can do. I hope our artists are good because that's all they have. And on this game we had, you know, I knew things were different when I came into this project, and we hired a new effects artist, Stephen Alexander, who's doing an amazing job. And we hired him a couple weeks after we hired him. I found him writing his own, you know, vertex and pixel shaders, and I thought, you know, wow, this is a big change from what we had before, where artists were just sort of painting textures, and now they're actually working very, very technically, working in, you know, high dynamic range lighting, and really, you know, we have now technical artists who are pushing the programming team and driving the tool set. And with this current generation of technology, we're actually able to do a lot of this stuff because it's actually really easy to create new effects, and the hardest part is really making them fit consistently in with the rest of the pipeline. So that's been a big challenge, is to create these beautiful new graphical effects, like all the water that you'll see in the game, you know, all the beautiful lighting effects, all the dynamic shadows, and getting all of those are easy to generate on their own, but they're very difficult to make them work consistently within the rest of the game. And that's necessitated another huge effort and very careful planning and a heck of a lot of luck. I mean, we have a amazing team in Australia who are doing, you know, just focusing on the core technology that lets us build the game. So most of the guys here are actually working on, you know, building the gameplay systems on top of the core tech, but there's just a massive effort on the other side of the world devoted to just laying the foundation for this. So tools team, you know, engine team, renderer team. There's lots more. I just can't remember them all. But yeah, so there's been a lot of effort gone into the tools just to allow people to create the kinds of experiences that we're creating now. So giving the designers the ability to do complicated scripting, building this huge AI system, which just allows the player to do basically anything he wants, has been a massive challenge, and I'm sure John Abercrombie, our AI programmer, our lead AI programmer, will talk a little bit about that.
We have our own behavior system that we've used before, and we were able to bring that over from a previous project and reuse it and extend some functionality of that. And basically, it allows us to, you know, encapsulate behaviors and have them be hierarchical and interrupt each other and those sorts of things. And it's called Tyrion. And because we'd worked with the system before, we had a lot of experience with it, and we could, you know, we knew, we had knowledge of how to use it well. And it allowed both us and the other programmers who had used it before to really do a lot more than we had, and prototype quicker and get things done faster than had we not had it, had we used stock Unreal. I think there's two big things for me that I spent time on. One was the interactions between the Big Daddies and Little Sisters, and we spent a lot of time like prototyping different behaviors and deciding which ones to go further with. And that was a lot of more time was spent doing that up front than later on. And the other thing is getting the splicers' attack behaviors correct, figuring out how they were going to fight to start with, and then building upon that and coming up with ideas that they could do things to make them more interesting. And certainly, I think those two would be the biggest things that I worked on.
On the animation side of things, we actually haven't taken what Unreal 3 provides. We're built on top of Havoc's animation SDK, which provides the groundwork for doing things like inverse kinematics and animation blending, animation playback, all sorts of good things.
Even though we do rely on music a bit in our game to kind of convey the mood, it was like a challenge for us to kind of inject that emotion into just kind of literal sound effects, like wind sounds and what are some other scary sounds that we had to make scary that would just be otherwise, like machine sounds, for example. All machines, it was important that they sounded broken and old and kind of random. Everything had to have this kind of filter of scariness and darkness and kind of degradation put over it. So nothing should ever sound like squeaky clean. Nothing should ever sound like it's in perfect working order. Nothing should ever sound like too happy. There had to be an element of kind of some kind of twisted brokenness to it. A lot of the machine VO, for example, like we had to like pitch shift it so it was going like really fast and then like really slow, and then we'd like break it up into like lots of different little sections. So yeah, so it just kind of sounded broken and weird, and would kind of creep people out. Like not everything's normal.
We would sample the composer Gary Scheinman sort of frequently, and just take sort of sections of string sounds and set them maybe like a semitone apart to just like create tension in the player as they're walking around the world. They might just hear a sting that might just sort of invoke some sort of emotion out of them. So everything from literal sound effects to machines to getting creative with music just creates this really frightening atmosphere.
Actually, like a lot of our inspiration kind of came from System Shock 2, which is just like, System Shock 2 had that really cool thing of the ambience was just so ominous and pressing all the time. It was like relentless. It was like this like psychological button that you'd just be like, okay, I'm afraid now. And there's no music or anything, just be this like unrelenting drone, you know? And so we definitely tried to like replicate that again in BioShock, and just kind of like you walk into a space and there's just like this really lonely hum there, and it's just like, ooh. You know, and it just freaks people out. It's great.
Yep. All the sounds in Rapture feel like they're from the period where the fiction takes place.
We had to like lay off the synth stuff.
Yep.
Like, you know, that was like one thing about BioShock that like as a sound designer we did not have the luxury of, and that is kind of like in a lot of like sci-fi games you have these like really synth heavy kind of soundscapes and alien sounds and, you know, weird kind of doors opening, and they're all like, it's all very kind of like synthetic driven sounds, you know, but like our whole sound palette was based off real recordings of very like old antique machines a lot of the time. In fact, I think like the ambience in Science, like Science is our most kind of techie deck, I guess you would say. It was like all those computers around, and we actually like sampled an old MS-20, like an old analog 1970s synthesizer to kind of like get that really kind of like authentic old computer kind of sound. It worked out pretty well. Our soundtrack is incredible, and it was composed by a guy called Gary Scheinman, and he was just like really into kind of the music direction for BioShock was this early 20th century like avant-garde kind of experimental orchestral stuff, which is a tough direction to nail. And I knew like Gary Scheinman was the guy for it, because anytime like he would like send me his own personal listening collection, the stuff he'd send me would just be this like, you know, completely weird avant-garde orchestral stuff. So I was like, he was the guy for the job. So our score for BioShock is like, I don't know, I consider myself a fairly comprehensive gamer, and I've never like heard anything like it. So yeah, and also we had like a live orchestra, like a lot of the guys from the LA Philharmonic are kind of playing, you can hear them playing in the background. We have like a really, really amazing like virtuoso violinist who plays all our main parts, which is incredible. Because we really wanted to get, and actually like when we recorded the orchestral stuff, we really wanted to get like the sound of, you know, humans, like turning pages, you know, like moving their fingers on the violin strings. Like it was very important that this didn't sound like a modern Hollywood score at all. It was very important it sounded more like a very old recording of, you know, of humans playing music. And that was definitely the direction for BioShock. Like even mistakes got like left in, whereas otherwise, like, you know, in like scores, you know, in other scores for games that are kind of like a big budget, you know, they have that very spiffy kind of feel to them. But yeah, we definitely wanted everything to just be completely human.
The process of voice recording was something that started out, I think we underestimated the scope of the amount of voice recording we have to do for the game. Because I've done a lot of games before, and somehow BioShock just got huge in this regard. And the amount of time writing, the amount of time recording, the amount of time casting and recasting was giant. It ended up being a huge project, and we had recorded in LA, recorded in Boston, and we recorded in New York. And so it was just kind of recorded all over the place, and I don't know, it was probably 40 or 50 different sessions. Like, it was just huge. It's not all right, Marine, let's, do this and that, the sort of standard things you see in video games. There was really such a broad range of characters, and making sure that they were not too, either too sort of not projecting their personalities enough or cartoonish, and finding that space between those two things was really challenging in a game like BioShock, because it has to be believable. That's the whole thing about this world. It's like this fantastical world where people have to believe in it. And you have guys like Sandra Cohen who are, they're out there, but you have to believe this guy could actually exist. And you've guys like Steinman, you have to believe it exists, these crazy people. And then, Ryan and Atlas and Tenenbaum, the Little Sisters. Those are all really tough characters to get, because they're really big personalities, and all you have is their voice. It's like radio. You don't have the actor's face. And if we had these actors' faces, it would have been so much easier, because they're all very capable actors. You don't have makeup. And you have these guys at the end of the day in the game are sort of these these sort of animated puppets, and making those guys be Space Marines or aliens is usually easy. That's believable. But making them sort of emote and make, when you see Sandra Cohen, that you believe it's the guy who's been talking to you, that's tough, and to line all those things up.